with the local Indian community here. As I know, most of the students are Indian. This is actually most of the teachings I've given have been predominantly foreigners, even though they've been in India at Tushita and Dharamsala at Root Institute in Bodh Gaya. So this is a center that actually is very nice that it reaches out to the local people as well. And so I'd chosen this topic also not knowing sort of the level of the students, what different people might be at different levels of experience with Buddhism. There might be some beginners, there might be some more advanced students. And so I wasn't sure what was be an apt approach. So I left it somewhat open. It's quite an open topic, talking about the Nalanda tradition and reasoning and logic and spiritual practice. And so I have quite a few things I can say, but at the same time, I think if people have particular things that they would like me to talk about, based on their own study, their own questions, we can certainly discuss those as well. It can be somewhat open as the time goes on. So I'll start with some things, but if people have particular things they would like to discuss also, please feel free to let me know, or you can write a little note or something like that. We can go through those, and I'll see when people have questions as well. That can give some idea as to what where people are at. So we say the Nalanda tradition and Indian philosophy, I feel it's a bit ironic. It's sort of like if an Indian person was to come to America or a European country and give a talk about ancient Greek philosophy to the people there. This is an Indian tradition, and certainly there are probably aspects of it that some of you will know better than I will. Where I've been studying for the past 17 years, as Renuka mentioned, at Sera Monastery. We're following this tradition. It's in Tibetan. The study is in Tibetan, and it's certainly culturally very influenced by the Tibetan worldview and Tibetan history. But at the same time, the root of it is Indian texts. We study. They call it the Shunkapo Nga, which means 5 main texts that we focus on. And of course, there are many others, but those 5 form the root of our study. And all of those are Indian texts. There's the Pramana Vardika Kartika, and I shouldn't say it in Sanskrit because my pronunciation will be terrible. Semanamdral, we say in Tibetan. This is by Dharmakirti. And then the Abhe Samayalamkara by Maitreya. And the Madhyamaka Vatara by Chandrakirti. Vinaya Sutra by Gunaprabha, and Abhidhammakosha by Vasubandhu. So those are the 5 main texts, and I imagine many of you know the names of the people, if not the names of the text. And these are all considered to have been Nalanda masters, except I guess we could say Maitreya, who is considered to be a celestial Buddha. We have him behind me here now, the statue. But it's believed in the tradition anyway that Asanga, the Nalanda master Asanga, had received these teachings in a divine inspiration directly from Maitreya. So our study is revolves around these texts, and of course there's the Tibetan interpretation of them. We study, as often happens in this tradition, the commentary to the commentary to the commentary, right? We have, for example, the Abhe Samayalamkara by Maitreya, then there's the commentary by Haribhadra. I think Sputarthata, I can't even pronounce the Sanskrit, but it's the Dharamsala in Tibetan, the clear meaning commentary. And so that is our approach. There's 21 different commentaries or Indian commentaries. And then there's the commentary to that text by Tsongkhapa, who's the Tibetan master who founded our school, the Gelug school, called the Golden Garland of Eloquence. And then commentaries by his students, Kyabje Choden and Gyaltsab, and then the textbook of Sera Jey Monastery, which is our own commentary by Jetsun Triki Gyaltsen, who was a master of our monastery in the 15th, 16th centuries. So that is what we study directly. But then we work our way backwards through the levels of commentary as it gets more and more difficult to understand. The modern commentaries are easier. I say 15th century is a modern commentary, but also, of course, we have our teachers that discuss it with us now in our own debate about it. But it all is tracing back to trying to understand the meaning of these quite obscure Indian texts. So for me, originally, I was a little hesitant about approaching this tradition. As many people nowadays, growing up in the modern world and then being attracted to Buddhism, one of the things that was very attractive to me was the idea of meditation, of trying to calm the mind a bit after all this intensive study for so many years, since I was 5 years old, up until I graduated college when I was 22, pretty much nonstop study. And so there was a thought, I really need to try a different approach, because that hadn't worked for what I was looking for in life. That's why I was looking for something different. And so the idea of this long-term study, I thought maybe originally when my teacher suggested coming to Sera, I would spend about 2 years there. But my teacher suggested, why don't you should try it, that this is something very worthwhile, and not just to put it aside, to at least try it. And so we started debate. My first day of debate was in the beginning of 2008, after I'd spent 2 years learning Tibetan. So you walk onto the debate courtyard, and it's like walking into the middle of an argument that somebody's been having for the past 2,000 years, and they're still arguing about it. And one of the questions is, what are we arguing about? I know that I want to meditate and I want to do spiritual practice. Why do we need to argue all these little points about it? But you gradually pick up over time, and it takes a long time, at least in the monastery. There's nobody like I'm sitting here now discussing with you why this is meaningful. There's nothing like that. It's just you just jump in. But you start to see over time the benefit of it, and the benefit of this intensive scrutiny for something that seems so straightforward. You start to see how it's not so straightforward, and you start to see that other things are not so straightforward either. A lot of things that we take for granted about who we are and the way the world functions aren't as straightforward as we thought. So I say the Nalanda tradition. So this is, of course, based on Nalanda Monastery, which is now what is today Bihar. They've now rediscovered the ruins of this ancient monastery. But in some sense, this is a bit of a construct, the idea of the Nalanda tradition, because it's not as though there was one tradition in ancient India at this one place in Nalanda that just continued on in Tibet. For one thing, there were many different strands of Buddhism in ancient India, as I'm sure many of you know, and these spread to different parts of Asia at different stages in their development, or different aspects of their development. So in some sense, the different strands of Buddhism in that exist now in different parts of Asia are kind of like snapshots of different pieces of ancient Indian Buddhism that got preserved or continued and developed in other places. And broadly speaking, we can talk about three different traditions. One is the Theravadan tradition in Southeast Asia, and then the Chinese Buddhist tradition, which spread into also Japan, Korea, Vietnam, in East Asia, and then the Northern Buddhist tradition, which was mainly centered in Tibet, and then also spread to Mongolia, Bhutan, Nepal, other areas of the Tibetan cultural influence. So it was this strand of Buddhism that spread to Tibet that we call the Nalanda tradition. It was a very late development chronologically in terms of Indian Buddhism, mostly in the latter half of the first millennium. And it was certainly, Nalanda was one of the major centers of this, but it wasn't the only one. There was also Vikramashila and Odantapuri were two of the other major monasteries, and there may have been others. I think now as far as I know, they've discovered the ruins of Vikramadhila, not of Vedanta Puri. That was quite recent. Nalanda was much longer ago. I think 1863 they first something like that. The Alexander Cunningham, the British archaeologist. I don't know if he was the one to discover it, but he was very instrumental in at least trying to figure out what it was. Somebody discovered this place and they didn't know what it was. And they finally put together that it was this ancient monastery that had been known about in India. There was still remnants of talk about this great monastic university, but it wasn't known where it was. I'm not sure if people were even sure if it was exactly whether it was a real place or what it was representing. So just briefly, in terms of the history of Nalanda, it seems that, as I said, about the 5th century, it first became started getting built up as this major monastic center. So already that throws into question we say the Nalanda tradition, and we generally one of the first masters we associate with that is Nagarjuna, who is generally believed to have taught around in the 2nd century CE. So that would predate Nalanda. Although there does seem to be quite a bit of evidence that he did teach in that area. And so there's speculation that even before there was all this royal sponsorship and building up of a university, there was teaching going on in this place. And it seems that even at the time of the Buddha did visit this place, Nalanda. The name was there. Nalanda, I guess, as I understand, again, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but I understand it means what is it, giving without interruption, something like that. Nalanda. I'm not sure how etymologically that works. In Tibetan, they don't translate it. They just say Nalanda. Most Sanskrit names will be translated into Tibetan, so we can figure out exactly what they mean. But we just say Nalanda.
It's like eternal giving.
Eternal giving. Okay, eternal giving. All right. How does that work? What is Nalanda? Okay.
Well,
yeah.
The stream will flow forever.
But I mean, the word Nalanda, which is eternal, which is giving? Do you know? Like, is Nala and Da? Is there?
Well, I think in terms of spirituality, this
Yeah.
will be the knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, etymologically, Nalanda, how would it break down into eternal giving? Does anybody know? No. Okay.
Yeah.
Earlier, the word used was Nalendra.
Nalendra, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what would that mean then?
And in Pali,
No, what would that mean?
No, I don't know. Indra is of course,
and power. Yeah. Yeah, actually in Tibetan, you're right. In Tibetan they do have the ra. The ra sound. In Nandlandra. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
stopping of the gift of
Yeah.
knowledge.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
So Na is no.
Yeah.
Alam, Da is giving.
Okay, so na is a negative particle. Okay.
Alam is knowledge. Da is
Allah is knowledge, yeah. And then alam, yeah. Alam, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there was, it seems that this was a bit of a change from what had been happening in India before, although it wasn't like a sudden change, but there was a gradual development into these settled monastic centers, whereas before the monks had been mainly itinerant. This was a major center, and so one of the main differences, for example, in Nalanda, it seems that the monks didn't go out begging, because it was not really possible if you had 5,000, 10,000 monks in a monastery with a small town nearby, it would overwhelm them. So it functioned by being sponsored by the king. The king had set up communities that specifically were farming and so forth to feed the monks, the monastery. And this seemed, especially later with the Pala kings, the Pala dynasty, they were sponsoring it. And so this was a major change in terms of Buddhist practice being centered in these large locations as opposed to spread out. But in terms of also the approach of the teaching, it became very much scholastic and focused on education and learning many different fields of knowledge. But I don't think this was a complete break from the Buddha's teachings, although some people present it as the Buddha gave these very kind of teachings that were not organized and not meant to be codified into a particular body of knowledge, and then later it was codified, and some people think that it was kind of out of accord with the Buddha's approach. But one way to see it is that the Buddha was very clear in his teaching that we need to question that the teaching is not something that I just hand to you, that I tell you, and you accept it. It should be something that you question and come to your own understanding and your own certainty about it. And so in that sense, that style of approach was implicit in the Buddha's teachings. And the Buddha was also very clear about the importance of learning. There's a whole body of for example, we said the Udana Varga, or sometimes the Dhammapada, it's often known as, that's this Pali name. So these are the collected sayings of the Buddha, and there's a whole chapter on the importance of learning. So for example, we say, I know it in Tibetan, not in Sanskrit. We say, Mikden marma yopahi, subnan tawa jitarwa, deshin geden jikbecho, tupi number sheparkyur. So somebody with eyes and a lamp can clearly see forms. In the same way, somebody endowed with learning can clearly discern between virtuous and non-virtuous actions. So learning is the key to any kind of spiritual practice, having a basis in understanding. And so this tradition then sort of branched out and engaged with what was going on at the time in India, as Indian culture in general was changing. It wasn't just Buddhism. In ancient India at the time of the Buddha, for example, it doesn't appear that there was writing. It was just within the century after the Buddha taught that their writing became something, although at the time of the Buddha it was there for things like business transactions. It wasn't something that you wouldn't write down spiritual teachings, but that it was just coming into play later. And so the culture itself was gradually adopting the use of writing and of logic, there was many different schools of logic in India at that time. And so some Buddhist practitioners chose to distance themselves from that, thinking that this was not in accord with the Buddhist teachings. It was better to preserve the way that it had been done previously. And this is a bit of an oversimplification, but there's some truth to it, that strand is what moved into Southeast Asia and the Theravadan tradition. Whereas there is some people who felt, some students of the Buddha who felt that actually we should engage with this. We shouldn't just withdraw and into our own tradition. We should engage with what's going on in the world. If it's becoming important to people's spiritual practice to have logic and to prove things through reasoning, then we should do the same. Otherwise, for one thing, we won't have many followers. Nobody's going to take us seriously. But also, there's an understanding that this will enhance our own development. It's not something that is just completely superfluous to our own practice. And so His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is in many ways the greatest representation of this tradition, represents what it stands for in today's world. He has given the example that some of you may have heard, which I think is quite nice. He says that the Pali tradition, he calls it, which is more correct than just saying Theravada. The approach is sort of that somebody hands you a candy and you just enjoy the sweetness of that candy. So this is like I was saying before, that the Buddha just gives you the knowledge and you have to practice that. Whereas in the Nalanda tradition is that you have teeth, that when somebody gives you something, you have to chew on it and come to your own conclusion about it. So this is how the tradition started to evolve. And within that, debate became a very essential part of the tradition. That learning doesn't come from being given knowledge. It comes through debating it yourself and coming to your own certainty about that. So that is the tradition that that moved on into Tibet. That because Tibetan Buddhism, the first wave, we say, the first propagation of the teachings from India into Tibet was in the 8th century, 7th and 8th centuries. And then later, actually much more so, around the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. So it was this very sort of the tail end of Buddhism in India, but also its strongest development in terms of this Nalanda tradition of that time. And so many of these masters themselves went to Tibet or worked directly with the translators to help them translate these texts and these ideas into Tibetan. And then within Tibet, it also had to go through its own process of development because for example, in the 11th century, Tibet was just coming out of a dark age and was trying to rebuild its own identity. So it took several centuries for it to really become solidified into the traditions that we now have. And it was in the 14th century that the teacher of our tradition, Tsongkhapa, was first teaching. And he was very much attracted to this tradition, almost took it for granted that this is the best way to approach the Buddhist teachings. And so he spent many years with intensive study and debating, and often came back to the same point again and again of the importance of study and reasoning. It's there, we see in his texts over and over again, that it's clear that there were many people who were debating with him on these points, because otherwise he wouldn't have debated about them so much in his texts, saying that meditation isn't just about emptying your mind of all thoughts, that it has to involve analysis. And so that is the tradition that we have today, that in our school, the Gelug school. And even within that tradition, of course, it went through processes of development. So again, for a few hundred years after Tsongkhapa, his students gradually codified his teachings, and then became what we have today, these several monasteries. We have our monastery, Sera, and then Drepung and Ganden, also the other major ones, and then Tashi Lumpo, and then, of course, the tantric colleges of Gyume, Gyuto, and some other smaller monasteries like Ratu. All of them very much built around a curriculum of debate and of these monastic textbooks that are written in a debate format. When we read, for example, I mentioned Jason Chugi Geltsen, the author of Sera Jey textbooks. It's not written in the style that we think of a modern textbook, where you have all the information very clearly laid out. So in a modern textbook, you might have 1.1, 2.1, the chapters, and then within the chapters, you'll have all these little bubbles of information that make it very clear what's going on. Whereas here, it's presented in a very non-direct way, very much like a debate. And oftentimes things are left ambiguous so that the students have to debate them. So this is what we've been doing in our monastery, and this is what I've been doing for the past years now, is trying to unpack what these people are talking about. So we see a picture of the Buddha, and he looks very peaceful. But then there's a big question, well, how do you get there? What is going on in this person's mind? It's very different than just seeing a picture. All you can really see is the physical manifestation of something else. And so trying to figure out what's really going on here. What does it really mean to do spiritual practice? So within this tradition, one thing they often emphasize, which Tsongkhapa also pointed out, is this distinction. So it can sound a little bit off-putting if it's labeled on particular people, but it's understood as two different kinds of approaches, which is, they say, the sharp faculty and the dull faculty, right? So the dull faculty approach to spiritual practice is it understood as following the person. That when you accept a particular teaching because the person who said it is very impressive. You want to be like them, or you think that what they say sounds authoritative. Whereas the sharp faculty approach is the followers of the Dharma, or the followers of reasoning. Those who don't accept something until they've ascertained it themselves. And so it said that the people who follow the person, the dull faculty approach, this will lead to realization more quickly. But the sharp faculty approach will lead to more stable realization that can't be overturned. Right? If somebody is following a particular person, if that person dies, or if that person starts to manifest unenlightened qualities, or if somebody else tells them, no, what you said is wrong and your teacher is wrong, they might change their mind. But for a person who's come to their own analysis, to their own conclusion, then that's not possible if they've really used good, proper reasoning. Of course, they always have to be open to the possibility that they could be wrong. And within this tradition, it said, I'm not sure how much this really happened. It's an interesting thing to research. But it said that in this tradition, that in India, when someone was debating, if they lost the debate, they were obligated to convert to the other person's side. This would seem almost that it would. There was no other way to do it, because if you were wrong, of course, you had to accept that you were wrong. Now, there's a question. Well, maybe you just couldn't debate so well. Maybe you were right, and the other person was a better debater. So that's why it's not totally clear how often this happened, but at least that's what's said to have been the tradition. So it's possible that one could be wrong, but if it's really based on correct reasoning, then it shouldn't be wrong. Correct reasoning, by its nature, is what establishes things in a non-erroneous way. So in that case, then somebody shouldn't be able to turn you back from your view. And it said also that what the person who follows through reasoning, that they enter the teachings through doubt. Tsongkhapa also talks a lot about this point. So it's not through belief, it's through doubt. And so doubt is an interesting term also. So doubt in English, it translates the Tibetan term taitsom, which I discovered in the past few years. The term taitsom in Tibetan translates 4 different Sanskrit words, all of which could have a slightly different meaning. So even in Tibetan, we've lost a little bit of the nuance of what was going on in Sanskrit. Because some of you might know, if you studied Buddhist philosophy, that, for example, in Lorik, the Minds and Awareness, we have the 6 root afflictions. One of them is taitsom, one is doubt. So it would not seem to be a way to enter the teaching if it's a delusion. But there's that word that is translated as doubt in Tibetan, which see, again, I'm not so good with the Sanskrit. The vishika, maybe somebody else knows. Vichika, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, we can check on that if anyone is interested. But there's 3 other terms, one of which some of you might know the ancient Nyaya system of logic. There's the 16 categories of logic, and the 3rd one is doubt. So this is a different word in Sanskrit. I think it's sandeha. Sunday. Yeah. Sunday. Yeah. Okay.
Not Sunday.
Okay. Sunday. Sunday. Yeah, exactly. So it's a different word. And it's going to have different implications. I haven't come to a precise clarity of what is the difference in terms of, I mean, I know there's a difference, but in terms of how to define them, because before we make a clear statement, this is what one means, this is what the other means, it's good to really know from the tradition. And we were discussing this recently when I was translating this book on the 6th session Guru Yoga. This question came up. And so there's one student at Sera Monastery who's a Sanskrit scholar, and I asked him to check into this. And even his teachers back at his university in Germany said that we can't make a definite statement right now. We don't want to make the wrong statement. It requires a lot more research into how these words were used in their different contexts. Yeah. Yeah, of logic. Yeah, Nyaya, Nyaya, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you also make a distinction between doubt and let's say the Sunday that we're talking about, where you're not sure?
Well, so tentatively, and this is just my speculation, but in terms of trying to understand what they're talking about, I would say that the afflictive doubt is a kind of what do you say? What's the word? Not being able to make up your mind. So a kind of hesitation that's involved in it. Because, for example, Vasubandhu in the Abhidhamma Kosha, so he says, again, I'll have it in Tibetan, not in Sanskrit. Dromi dodan lamno ortang, lana tetsam dijinechik. So he's saying that there's three main obstacles to entering a spiritual path. And one is not wanting to go, which is understood to mean self-grasping, that there's a strong sense of me and who I am. I don't want to change. So then the second one is wrong paths. So this is understood that you do want to do some kind of spiritual practice, but you get involved in something that's actually leading you in the opposite direction, like torturing the body or something like that. And then doubt about the path is the third one. So in this context, it seems that it's like you want to follow a path, but you just never get around to it. You're always a little bit hesitant because you don't have confidence in yourself about maybe I can do this. You don't step out and do it. So it's interesting that word in the Abhidhamma Kosha, which we have the Sanskrit, is sanda, I believe. Yeah, right, Sunday. So that would imply that that's actually the positive kind of doubt. But in the auto commentaries, Vasubandhu's own commentary on it, he says that it's Sunday that is impelled by vishika, the afflictive doubt. So it's like you're analyzing it, but you're analyzing it out of a sense of lack of confidence or lack of decision.
Sunday is
Yeah.
more like suspicion.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah, suspicion. Exactly. Yeah. I'll mention that because Chandrakirti, he makes that point.
Suspicion
So, yeah.
is that if it's the right path.
Yeah,
If it's the right
exactly.
path,
Yeah.
okay, I'm doing it,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
the
yeah,
right
yeah,
path,
yeah, yeah.
It's a suspicion.
Yeah,
You're not sure, you see.
I'm not sure, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
based on logic.
Yeah. Exactly.
We say this a lot, this Sunday.
Sunday, and even, okay, yeah.
I don't have any suspicion.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah, I'm certain. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry,
yeah.
just
Yeah,
like to
please.
analyze it, but it's based on some used words.
Oh, so it's based on kind of a lack of confidence or hesitation about it. Yeah.
That is that is not
Yeah.
based on some logic.
Yeah. Okay. This is what I was trying to remember what word I had settled on. I said indecisiveness. So I think the afflictive one is a kind of indecisiveness. So this in Sanskrit, we have the text by Vasubandhu. He's saying that we could say it's indecisiveness, suspicion that is impelled by indecisiveness. But in Tibetan, it's just translated as tetsum that is impelled by tetsum. So there's no nuance about what it's talking about. So even in Tibetan, we've already lost that point.
So this indecisiveness, could it be emotional or intellectual or both? Or
Yeah, definitely it could be both. I don't think it doesn't seem that.
There's something else above all this, more spiritual.
Well, it's interesting that because these terms, emotional and intellectual, it doesn't seem that they had quite that same distinction in their system, like in this system of the 51 mental formations that we have that comes from the Abhidhamma Kosha. I mean, it comes from the Buddhist teachings, but it was codified in there. there doesn't seem to be this distinction. And so sometimes it's been translated the 51 emotions, but then among these there's things like analysis and sleep, for example. We wouldn't call those emotions in modern parlance. So this is actually a point that I was going to discuss, is how we have a lot of our own ideas now, which I'm not saying are right or wrong, but sort of we have spirituality, religion, psychology, emotion. And so what do those mean in terms of the mind? So even to understand what these ancient Indian people were talking about, we have to see that they had very different categories and ways of classifying it. And so I think that can affect even how we relate to our own experience. We think that this isn't a spiritual experience, this is a psychological experience, something like that. Well, where is the distinction? How do we make that clear distinction? People will say, well, I'm a spiritual person, not a religious person. Again, we have to be very clear on what is the difference. If we make a very clear boundary and define it, then we can make that kind of distinction. But otherwise, when I say that, somebody else might hear it very differently than the way that I mean it. So here, in terms of when they say doubt or indecisiveness, there seems to be, it would appear that, my best interpretation of how they understood it is that what we call emotion, they understood as being kind of a interplay of many subtle conceptual thoughts that were not, because it's going on at a kind of pre-conscious level. It's experienced as a physical or sort of a feeling, but it's not. It's actually, if we really analyze it, it's based on a whole thought process, like a complex of thoughts, we might say, that are not, that are a bit dull, but in terms of conscious awareness. So it's just experienced as some kind of general mood or sensation. So for them, underneath the doubt is a particular pattern of thought, but it might just be experienced as, I'm not sure, I don't know, I don't feel confident in following a spiritual path. So, so I mentioned that Vasubandhu, he uses this term. So he uses Sunday, but then it's Sunday that is impelled by Visheka. But then we have Chandrakirti. So actually, this is Arya Deva, who is the student of Nagarjuna. He, in his text, the 400 stanzas, so he has this passage that says that even just to have a moment of doubt towards the teaching on emptiness is enough to shake the foundations of samsara, or to tear the fabric of samsara. So that's very different than Vasubandhu saying that it's the main obstacle to entering the spiritual path.
But with a sort of suspicion.
Exactly, yeah.
Suspicion, the nature of the world is what we call
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
But then when we are questioning the teaching itself, is it the right thing that I'm thinking about? So that's the difference. But the feeling is same. Suspicion, that's the same.
Yeah, well, in this context, whereas Vasubandhu is saying it's Sunday that is impelled by Visheka, it's not the case here with Aryadeva. That's the difference, is that he's still using Sunday, as I recall. And then in the commentary on that by Chandrakirti, so Chandrakirti wrote a commentary in the 400 stanzas, he uses what, as you say, that's a good point, it would be very much likely to translate as suspicion, the way that he describes it. So he gives an allegory kind of to understand how we can understand what this term means here. So he says that there was some sailors that were stranded on an island, and they were locked up by this evil ogress who lived on the island. And she told them, when she locked them up, never look behind this hill, something like that. But one of the sailors, we say, he was suspicious. What is really behind that hill? So finally, one day he looked behind the hill, and there was this magic horse that flew them all back to safety at the mainland. So he's saying that this is similar to when you're stuck in samsara and you think, oh, I should never examine this. This isn't something that's worth checking. But yeah.
Or let's say all of the others.
Yeah.
The others. The one was suspicious.
Yeah, yeah.
Found out. What
Yeah.
about the others? The others were also in a sort of doubt.
Yeah.
And they might not be something like that.
Well, that's the opposite kind of
That's the
doubt.
opposite.
Yeah, that when you think, oh, it's not even worth checking.
Right.
So in Tibetan, we don't have different words, but there is an understanding that there's different kinds of doubt. I mean, in the Lyric teachings on minds and awarenesses, there is that this is taught that the two main different kinds of doubt, one is that tends towards the non-factual and one that tends towards the factual. And they're very different in terms of how they affect us, because the one tending towards non-factual is what is an obstacle. I think of it sometimes as cynicism. We have the word in English, where it's sort of that I just don't even want to examine this because I'm sure it's wrong. It's I've lived long enough to know that there's no better way to live your life, and so there's no reason to listen to somebody who thinks that they have a better solution to things. So then you close yourself off from any kind of development. Versus if you have this positive kind of doubt, this is what I would call skepticism in the positive sense. In science, we have the term skepticism as the root of science. It's not, sometimes in the modern terms, people use skepticism as a negative thing, that you're too skeptical about everything, but really it should be understood as something positive, that you are wanting to question because you're interested. So another use of this term doubt in Indian text is a text by Dharmottara, another Indian scholar, called Examining the World. So it's, and again in Tibetan I'll have it. So he's saying that the worldly ones with interest will enter even out of doubt. So this is what Tsongkhapa quotes when he talks about the shop facultied approach. He says that that if you have the right kind of doubt, then it shows that you're interested in what is being said, and so you don't just put it aside. So this is the sign of somebody who's sharp facultied, is that they can go on for years and years like this. They're willing to have two different incongruent ideas in their mind, that this could be right or this could be right, and not settle on one and say it's definitely this. Be willing to sit with that uncertainty for a long time, and that will eventually lead them to the right answer. And so he uses that idea of how to approach a text. So he's talking about this text Abhe Samayalamkara that I mentioned before, which is a very confusing text. If you just look at this text and try to read it without having any context, it doesn't make any sense. And even when you know the context, it's pretty hard to see how a lot of the parts make sense. So one reaction would be just to reject this and say these ancient Indian people, they think that this celestial Buddha named Maitreya composed this text, but it was just some weird cult that had these ideas that sounded very esoteric and spiritual, but they didn't really have any substance to them. That's one way to approach it. The other one would be to say, it looks like there might be something really valuable here. There's some reason to suspect that. And so I will take the time to examine what it's saying, even though I'm not really sure. Maybe I'll find out in the end that it was all just bogus, but maybe I'll find out that there was something worthwhile. So you have to approach it with that understanding. So that is this entering through doubt. Yeah.
Commentaries that you spoke about in itself. So what's the prime reason for coming up with a new commentary? Is it with the passage of time that you have a new insight on what the essence of the text is? Or is it because the divergence through time into various traditions? Or something else? Like, how does one decide that so many commentaries are
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the straight direct answer that the tradition would give, which honestly I will say I'm a little skeptical about, is that in ancient times people had more pure karma, and so just with this very simple teaching, it was very easy to understand. So they didn't need any commentary. The Buddha could say something. So that, for example, the Abhaya Samayalamkara, it's a comment, it itself is understood as a commentary on the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, Prajnaparamita Sutras. And it's said that it's the most sharp faculty person would just hear those sutras and immediately understand. But in later times, people became, their minds became thicker and they needed a little bit more explanation. And so then progressively more and more as time went on, so the commentary is making it more and more clear. Another way to understand it is that as different times change, people's way of understanding things changes, and they need to be spoken to in their own culture, in their own context. So we don't know what people were thinking 2,500 years ago. We can have some idea from reading things that they said, but it's hard to completely enter into their mindset. And so things need to be said in a way, as Renuka was just saying, where you talk about emotion and psychology. These are words that we can relate to. And they don't have terms for those kinds of things. So whether it's because people are not as intelligent or it's just that people are different. Another way we could see it, which maybe is heretical, but every idea can be taken as something to consider, is that as time goes on, that their tradition develops, and it comes up with better ways of explaining it than were there in the past. That's also a possibility. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. As I said, with the Abhisamayalamkara, there are generally considered to be 21 major Indian commentaries on it. Many of them not only diverge, but directly attack the other ones and say that this person is wrong for such and such reason. And
I wonder what AI is going to come out.
What's
AI, artificial intelligence.
Oh yeah.
So if we, feel all this over there.
Yeah.
I think it'll be an interesting exercise.
What
Maybe.
commentary will come out of that?
Yeah, maybe they'll come up with the best commentary so far by an AI author.
It'll come up with
Yeah.
whatever is fed into it.
Yeah.
And it could be the trashiest.
Yeah, well, let's see. Yeah.
But
Well, yeah. If we have time, and we'll see as the weekend goes on. Yeah. What's it? Yeah. Yeah.
Those two possibilities.
Yeah.
One, that people were not really more intelligent, but the minds were more pure.
Pure.
in,
Yeah.
Quotes.
Mhm.
Or that, things evolved and changed, and there was a new way to explain it. So, but both of those would be together.
Yeah, it's
They
true.
would be equally valid.
Yeah.
A combination of both of them.
Absolutely. Yeah. These aren't mutually exclusive possibilities. Yeah.
Also, I like to add that it's not about intellect. I think when we are reading these texts, it's more about awareness and attention and purity in the sense of people who are more attentive. People who are more
that might be
aware.
true. I think, yeah.
Even negative people can be very attentive.
So
yes.
it's need not be
Attentive in the sense of awareness, aware of one's. Can you
Yeah.
observe your own self, your
Yeah.
own
It's a difficult question. That's a very different.
awareness?
Yeah, it's a very broad question, but it's very useful. Is about how are people now different from how people were in the past. One thing I think that's pretty clear, if we have to make one thing that we can point to that's different, is that in the past people probably had much better memories for things because simply they were less distractions, but also they just trained their memory more because things weren't written down. So a lot of people might say, well, it's probably just an ancient fable that Ananda, who was the Buddha's disciple, his attendant, that when the Buddha passed away, he recited from memory everything the Buddha had said throughout his entire life. But maybe that's true. There actually is quite some evidence that people in ancient cultures or in even modern cultures that don't have writing, for example, people in Australia, they've done studies on them, that their memory is much better for things that people say because they're not used to relying upon external props to remember things for them. So nowadays, even more so, we have a phone. As soon as you need some information, you can just look it up on your phone. So who needs an expert when you have all the information right there?
You see,
Yeah.
like our parents,
Yeah.
they can recall things from
Yeah.
childhood, not
Yeah.
much that we do. We don't
Yeah.
remember incidents to that very detail. That
Yeah. So that's, okay.
Can we sum it up in a way to say that the exposure is different? People's minds, exposure at different times over 1,500 years has been changing.
Yeah, so it may not be that people are more or less intelligent, it's a matter of what they trained in. So the opposite thing is that what's also been demonstrated quite conclusively, this was actually demonstrated before it was explained, in terms of it wasn't demonstrated trying to prove the point, it was just noticed, is that people's IQ is getting higher and higher. It's called the Flynn effect, because the person who noticed it was named Flynn, that the IQ test has to be readjusted every several years because it's supposed to be averaged at 100, but it has to keep changing because people get higher and higher scores. So there are some things that are going in the other direction. There's a lot of different ways to explain why that is, but there's still quite a bit of controversy as to why. But so it's clear that in some ways, people's minds are changing in a different way, maybe for the better. Maybe it's just that people are training more in that style of thinking, and so it becomes more natural.
But I would like to add in that sense, you can imagine when Panini documented the grammar, Sanskrit grammar, 700, 800 century BC, documenting entire Sanskrit grammar, putting things in sutra. Sanskrit existed before. But it was a tremendous work and required a lot of mental attention and tremendous amount of the memory. Because recollection of all the rules and organizing all those rules and putting together the present day linguist Chomsky. He says that Panini probably used the mind of his people's students, large number of people, to memorize the sutras. And he probably might have used those people's mind as a scratch pad memory. And using those, it's like using many small computers and organizing things. And, documented the grammar, Sanskrit grammar, and which present day also is very special in the sense that there is no ambiguity in the Sanskrit. Like Rama, Salam Gachami. Salam Gachami Rama. Rama Salam Gachami. Gachami Rama Salam. All they have the same meaning. There is no ambiguity. It's very rare in any of the languages.
Yes.
So you can imagine the mind of that person and concentration. One can construct a grammar which is totally so it's right that people probably were having tremendous memory of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, also using the students that you kind of as a sounding board, maybe you could say, which is also part of this tradition. It's not just about memorizing things. We debate them, and in debate, you're essentially, it's like your minds are working together. Somebody else is pointing out to you immediately. You as a flaw, you didn't remember this thing, or there's some contradiction in what you said earlier and what you said later. And so that's why it's very useful to not just a one person thing. Memory is a collective phenomenon that we can prompt each other's memories and help each other to remember things and to refine the understanding. And so it does seem, as you say, that Sanskrit was quite unique in that way, in terms of being kind of designed as a language that would be that would function so well. Of course, whether it was I think the Buddhist view, and the Dharmakirti, one of the ancient Indian Buddhist philosophers, it was argued very strongly that this was man-made phenomenon, whereas another view of it is that it was a divinely inspired one that wasn't something that anybody came up with. It just was spontaneously there, or that a creator God created it. There's also, there's even within that view, there's even within the non-Buddhist view, the Vedic standpoint, there's seems to be at least two understandings. One is that either it was just spontaneously manifested, or that Brahma or some other creator deity created it. But whatever the case is, wherever it came from, it's clearly quite unique in that way. And as I said, it's unfortunate I don't have the Sanskrit background. It's not something we learn in our monastery. It sort of got lost. There was originally, as I said, all these texts were translated from Sanskrit. But after a few hundred years in Tibet, people stopped reading the Sanskrit and just studied the Tibetan. The literary Tibetan language is based on Sanskrit. It has no relation in terms of the roots of the words. So none of the grammar, none of the what do you say? None of the terms are the same. None of the words are the same. But the grammar is based on the Sanskrit grammar, because it was specifically invented to translate the texts. Is in the 8th century, they invented a written language in order to be able to translate the Sanskrit text. So it does preserve at least some level of the nuance, so that not all of it. But in any case, they stopped reading, and unfortunately, they also stopped copying the texts, which is why we've lost a lot of the ancient Sanskrit texts, because very few of them were preserved in Tibet. That at a certain point, they just kept the Tibetan copies. And very few of the people learned Sanskrit. My teacher, Choden Rinpoche, did actually learn Sanskrit, which is unusual. He didn't learn it at Sera because it wasn't part of the curriculum. But there are some Tibetans who learn it. Nowadays, if they do so, they usually will go to a different, for example, in Varanasi, they can go to the Central Institute of Tibetan Higher Studies there. Or some of them go to a university in Pune. I'm not sure if they're all going to the same one or not, but I know a lot of them, at least some of the monks who do that, they go to Pune and study Sanskrit. Anyway, so there's a lot of points that I brought up here, and I meant to just mention, getting back to what you asked a few minutes ago about AI, that I want to talk about that a little later, maybe if we have time in one of the subsequent days. Not in terms of AI composing text. I hadn't thought of that, but in terms of that's a major question in terms of understanding of the mind, is whether AI is I, whether it is intelligent, or whether it's just a very good imitator or mimic of intelligence. So, and as I said, I want to see what people are interested in. We can go different directions. So I'll continue with kind of my structure here, but as the time goes on, and later today or tomorrow, if people want to explore other things that I've talked about, I can go more into them. So one of the things that's emphasized in this tradition is the idea of broad knowledge, not just having knowledge of one particular thing. So again, there's a quotation that's often used. This is from the Mahayana Sutralamkara, which is also attributed to Maitreya. There are 5 texts that were said to have been divinely inspired, that Asanga had written down. So there he says, again, I'll have to recite it in Tibetan. He says, Ripa denga dagla tsumpa mache na Tamche Kenny Migirway, I'm missing the second line. Migirway, Deche Shenla Dela Shenla Suncher, Jason Tang, Rani Kunshe Chacher Dela Det Sun Cha. So that means if I don't study the 5 sciences, the 5 disciplines, then even though somebody might be very knowledgeable, or I or somebody, this is kind of ambiguous whether it's I or third person, but anyway, that person will not become a omniscient one. So in order to subdue opponents and to guide disciples, I must study these 5 sciences. So the 5 sciences in ancient India, we had grammar and logic, which are understood as these are the ways of defeating opponents. So he uses this term, defeating opponents. And then medicine and craftsmanship. These are ways of looking after one's disciples. And then inner science, which here is meditation, or could just be more broadly understood as, here it's Buddhism, but could be more broadly applied to meditation. But really what this is a metaphor for is all fields of knowledge. Right? These were the major fields of knowledge in ancient India. They were the five minor sciences and other ways of categorizing them. But it's really, I must know all fields of knowledge. So really, if we say in Mahayana Buddhism that the goal is omniscience. So how can somebody become omniscient if they're not a master of all fields of knowledge? Doesn't make much sense. Somebody who is omniscient, they shouldn't have some gap in their knowledge. But how practically how this approach functioned is that the monks or other Buddhist scholars at the time were encouraged to not just focus on Buddhist texts. It's not enough just to know your own discipline. If you want to engage with the world, if you want to be able to defeat opponents, or we could say today, have dialogue with your opponents, or if you want to be able to look after disciples who come from a variety of backgrounds, you have to understand where they're coming from. Otherwise, it's like speaking a different language. If you don't know the person's language, it's very hard to communicate with them. So, as I've mentioned before about His Holiness Dalai Lama being the representative of this tradition today, that's something he's often emphasized, and he emphasized it when he met with the founders of our house at Sera. Some of you might know that I live in a house for foreigners at Sera Monastery, and 22 years ago now, when they founded the house, this was before I was there, they were fortunate to have an audience with His Holiness, who advised them about how to structure this house when you're making a house for foreigners. And that's something he really emphasized, is that you need to study many broad fields of knowledge, that this is something that's not easy to do, and it takes a long time. Because this is an approach to spiritual practice that isn't just instantaneous. So over a long period of time, gradually becoming proficient in many different fields of understanding. And His Holiness himself has manifested that, as we see that besides just being the spiritual head of the Tibetan people, he's able to dialogue with politicians about politics, and with scientists about science, psychologists about psychology, and not just in a superficial way, really in a very meaningful way. He's made important contributions to politics, being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's made very important contributions to cognitive science. These mind life conferences that he's organized, it's not just it hasn't just been kind of a way of a feel good thing of trying to show that there's some bridge between spirituality and Western psychology. It's actually sparked whole new fields of Western psychology in terms of the first person perspective, as they talk about it. So Francisco Varela, who founded the Mind Life Conference under the guidance of His Holiness, he was very influential in this field of the first person approach to psychology and to psychological research. So in this way, it becomes very relevant. It's not just something, it doesn't just become something that's kind of irrelevant to the ordinary society. Whereas, some small group of people who has their spiritual cult, but it's not, most people aren't interested in it. It actually can reach a much broader demographic of people. And there are those who will go much more deeply into it. That's not going to be the most people, but not everyone has to do that. And so people can approach it from their own level of development and still get something out of it. So in this tradition, there's a lot of guidelines for how to do that. It's not just saying you should do that, but how to do so. So, for example, if we study the bodhisattva vows, that's right there in some of the secondary vows about how to go about dealing with other traditions. And so, for example, one shouldn't study other traditions if before having a good grounding in the Buddhist philosophy. So, for example, if somebody is a new Buddhist, it's good to get a really clear understanding of what Buddhist philosophy is before mixing it with all kinds of different traditions. Otherwise, it becomes kind of watered down. You don't get a very clear picture of what the Buddha was saying. But then later on, it's encouraged, if somebody has the mental capacity to do so, to start to engage with other traditions. And then there's guidelines for how to do that. But even that, yes, it's there in some of these bodhisattva vow commentaries, which were composed. Again, this major commentary that I'm talking about is by Chandra Gomin, who was a lay follower at Nalanda. But even in the original teachings of the Buddha, we have in the Vinaya, the code for the monastics. So there's an example of Shariputra, who was the Buddha's great disciple, who was proficient in a lot of non-Buddhist fields of knowledge at the time. He was spending time learning non-Buddhist philosophies, and somebody complained to the Buddha and said that he's wasting his time and you should punish him. There are quite a few examples of this in the ancient sutras, of people complaining about Sariputra and telling the Buddha he didn't do it right. And in every case, the Buddha said, actually, he knew better than anyone else. So actually, he even before I gave permission to do this, he was doing it correctly. But he said that in his case, it is actually beneficial that he does this. And then at some point, somebody else complained again that, well, he's doing it too much. And even then, the Buddha said, in his case, he can do it as much as he likes. But again, it's understood that it depends on the capacity of the person. They have to be careful. And if somebody has that mind, so for example, in the Bodhisattva vow commentary, Natsukapa, he codified this, but it's not his own creation. But he lists 6 different qualifications that somebody ought to have if they're going to spend a lot of time studying non-Buddhist philosophies. And one of the main ones is a very stable grounding in the Buddhist philosophy, such that studying the non-Buddhist philosophy will not overturn your own sense of refuge. But at the same time, it can be approached, to different degrees, depending on the capacity of the person and the level of development. But the main point is that it's emphasized, it's encouraged. And so that's, in addition to this sharp facultied approach, that's a second thing, is also, that goes hand in hand with it, is this broad perspective. The Buddhist practitioners shouldn't just be knowledgeable about Buddhism. And so I think, and His Holiness also has said this, that we have to apply that to today's world. So it shouldn't just mean we're proficient in the 5 sciences of grammar and logic and craftsmanship and medicine, but today we have science and history and other disciplines that may not have been there in the same way and at that time when those texts were composed. And so we can engage with those in a very meaningful way. And so I'll talk quite a bit about that as time goes on, about these. So then before I get to that, one last point just about the training. So we started with this idea of whether this path of reasoning is the right approach to spiritual practice, or rather whether in meditation that kind of goes beyond reasoning. And so some of you also might know that there are examples of Nalanda scholars who at a certain point rejected this approach. I wouldn't say rejected this approach, that's not quite right, but rejected the institution. So one of the most famous of these, some of you might know, is Naropa, who's said to have been the abbot of Nalanda. And at a certain point, he left. The story goes anyway that one day he was sitting reading a book with his back toward the sun, which is supposed to be symbolic. And then an old woman came and looked at what he was doing and said, "What are you doing here studying?" And he said, "Well, I'm learning the Buddhist philosophy." And she said, "Well, do you understand it?" And she said, first she said, "Do you understand the words?" He said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Well," and she was very happy. She was delighted when he said this. She said, "Yeah, you understand the word. That's wonderful. you understand the meaning? So he thought, well, if I tell her, I told her I understood the words and she was so happy. So if I say I understand the meaning, she'll probably be even happier. So he said, I understood the meaning, but she became very sad when he said that. And he took it to his own understanding that she was right, that he knew all the words now, but he had not actually gotten to the meaning of what was being talked about. And so that's when he left the monastery to follow Tilopa, his guru, which it might not seem so shocking, but we have to think about the context. This was the abbot of a great monastery, a very respected person. We have people like that today. We have the abbots of our monasteries who are often very formal, very traditional. So he went to follow this old beggar man who lived in a shack down by the river, and people thought he was crazy. And for many years, 12 years, it said that he followed him around and followed every injunction that Tilopa gave, no matter how crazy it was. So whether this is just an allegory or whether this actually happened literally, as it's in there, it's not, who knows? But it's quite an interesting allegory nonetheless, that this was it's part of a tradition. But the reason I bring that up is, so sometimes people can hear these stories, people like Naropa, and think that the tradition is negating itself. It's saying that actually all of this is useless. You need to let all of this go and go beyond all of this heavy emphasis on reasoning and analysis. But actually, one of the most non-conventional teachers of recent history, some of you might know Chogyam Trungpa, he tells this story of Naropa. He gave some teachings in the West to his disciples about Naropa. And I thought it was very interesting the way that he presented it. He said that it's very dangerous to give these teachings because people will get the wrong idea. Because in Western culture, at least at the time, is still today, but even more so, I think, in the 60s, 70s when he was teaching, there was this idea of nonconformity that we read about Naropa, that he left the monastery. It's like the hip young abbot who leaves the square monastery to go out and do his own thing and follow his own path. And then people will get a very wrong idea that therefore all of the traditional teachings are just sort of boring and outdated. But we have to look at the entire picture of the story. That it wasn't, the story started with Naropa entering the monastery at a young age and training for 20, 25 years before he did this. And that's an essential part of the element of the story. So it's at a certain point, you can go beyond this. It's possible to go beyond reasoning. That doesn't mean that you reject it, but the mind can actually function in a way that is, intuitive. But it doesn't mean that it's very different from the kind of primal reaction that we have before we actually train in reasoning. It's like somebody who's very skilled in a particular subject or a particular activity. So like somebody who can play the piano is one example. At a certain point, they don't need to rely upon all of these notes and the scripts of how to play it. They can just play it and improvise, and it comes out beautifully. But that doesn't mean that you just put a child at the piano and that's going to happen. It's quite a different stage of development when somebody has trained their mind in something for a long time and then can do it spontaneously, versus just somebody who is a complete beginner asking them to approach something spontaneously. So that is part of the tradition. There's an understanding that this can be transcended, but transcending it is very different from avoiding it. Okay, so I mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit about how this relates with science and in terms of in modern fields of discipline. So I think I'll get into that a little bit now. We have about 40 minutes left, 35 minutes left in this session or so. We decided we weren't be too strict about timings. but maybe I'll just start with it a little bit. It's a very big subject. But then also want to have time. We've already had quite a bit of back and forth, but also we'll have some time for question and answer. But I think it's useful at least to start with it, and we can get more into it in the afternoon. So with science, one thing I think is useful to reflect upon is how science came into being, the history of it, because often it's taken as science is just a kind of a field of knowledge, whereas I see science as a way of training the human mind. And that's how it originally developed. It's a way of thinking that became highly refined and very useful in a lot of practical modes of application. So I'm not a historian of science, and I can't speak from a place of expertise. I've just read a few things about this that I think are useful to present here. And of course, I'm presenting the how science developed in Europe. So it may be a bit narrow also, because it didn't come out of nowhere, and there were other fields of ancient philosophy and disciplines that are contributed to it. But at least directly in terms of what we call modern science now, it grew out of certain movements that were going on in Europe in the 15th, 16th century. So where did these come from? Out of the medieval style of thinking. So in the Middle Ages in Europe, which was obviously it's not just, we didn't say influenced, but some people would even say oppressed by theological thinking, Christian theological thinking. One common view among many of the Christian philosophers was that it's not useful to examine the physical world, because what we're trying to access is the mind of God, and the physical world is just a pale shadow of that. There's actually quite a lot of grounding in Platonic philosophy here, even though they might not have admitted to that. The idea that there's something transcending all of this, and that comes through the use of reasoning. So with reasoning, we can access God. We can access the mind of God, because God's mind is inherently reasonable. Whereas with examining these external things that don't function in any cohesive way, then we won't get anywhere. It's just, we say the flesh is, what's the word? Is sort of profane or fallen. So that view prevailed for a long time, and had obviously practical consequences, that people didn't examine the external world. And it was believed that things could be better understood through independent reasoning than through kind of experimentation with physical things. There was a lot of suspicion about that. But that view gradually changed for a whole number of reasons, and I don't know all of them, and I don't want to get into all of them. But both political and economic and just simply intellectual reasons. And gradually there came to be an alternative, which was that God has created this external world, and therefore, by examining this, we can understand who God is, because we can understand through his creation, through the effect, who the creator was. So again, this is a particular way of thinking about things. This is a particular way of conceiving our experience and labeling physical things in a certain way, labeling mental phenomena in a certain way. And then once they're labeled that way, they're experienced that way. So early on in the history of science, one philosopher who was very influential was, of course, René Descartes, the French philosopher, who was quite explicit about this, that there's the physical world, which follows all of these physical laws. There's the mental world, of which only humans have access. It's not something that animals have. That's why he would, how do you say, what's the word? Vivectomy, unfortunately, performing, how do you say? We say when you dissect a corpse, right? But doing it with a living thing, right? He would do this with animals because he thought that they were just like robots. They didn't have the word robot at the time, but nowadays we use the word robot. Any reaction they were giving wasn't coming from any inner feeling. It was just a physical reaction. Whereas the human being has this unique capacity to connect with the spiritual realm, the mental realm, which is completely different from the physical realm. So this became the dominant paradigm for quite a while in science, and therefore science is about examining the physical realm. Religion is about examining this spiritual realm or the mental realm. So that way of thinking obviously itself has its own practical consequences, both in terms of behavior and what people value and think of as important, and what science is understood to be. So science there becomes the study of the physical world and the physical realm. Gradually, that view also started to change. As science became more and more powerful in terms of explaining the physical realm, and religions started to seem more and more outdated, people started to question, well, maybe there is no mental realm at all. Maybe it's all physical. Maybe what we just call the mental is simply a manifestation of physical processes. Because we can explain all of these, a lot of things that once were taken for granted as being simply God created them, were starting to be explained by physical causes. So maybe it's the same with the mental realm. And gradually that view also became pretty standard and almost at this point, I would say dogmatic in the scientific world. But that's something that's really useful to examine. First of all, was there ever any major discovery that made that clear? So was there a time, for example, evolution, I don't know if we say discovery of evolution, but the understanding of evolution that we usually attribute to Darwin, but was really came through with many people over a period of time, and is continuing to evolve itself, this understanding. That made pretty clear a good alternative to the idea that God created every individual species. And so that we could point to, when did people start to question the idea that that species were created individually by God? Well, it's when we came up with evolution. But I don't think it's as easy to point out a point where it was made clear what is consciousness and how is it related to the physical realm. But it's become more and more ingrained in the thinking, such that it's often seen as synonymous. When we say a scientific worldview, it's seen synonymous with a materialistic worldview. That a scientific worldview takes for granted that everything has a material cause. And therefore, a view of a non-material mind is often labeled as an unscientific view. Now, if it's what should be an unscientific view is something that's not falsifiable, I would think. I mean, maybe different scientists and different philosophers of science will have different definitions of this. But what makes something scientific is something that can be tested and proven wrong. If it can't be proven wrong, then it's not a scientific statement, because there's no way to scientifically analyze it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. Even in science, that has to be understood, that something could be non-scientific view, but it doesn't mean that just because something can't be proven wrong doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that it's beyond the realm of science to explain it. But furthermore, my main point here is that the question of whether the idea of a non-material mind is something that's non-falsifiable. It's certainly not falsifiable in the same way that a lot of physical things are. So, for example, with evolution, creationism, and I apologize if anybody holds this view, but it seems pretty well falsified at this point. The idea that God created the world 6,000 years ago. There's a lot of evidence to the contrary that is hard to interpret in a different way, although there are many people, especially in my country, who are trying to do so. It's hard, it's not very convincing to me anyway. However, with the mind, it's a different question. Is there a lot of very strong evidence that mind is a purely physical thing. And certainly there's a lot of evidence that will be that will be cited if somebody is asked, somebody who's a very strong materialist. But to me anyway, it's not as convincing. It certainly requires explanation, and it's not something that we can just ignore, but it's something that is left open. And so this is something, because of course I think the title of these talks was the Nalanda Tradition and its relevance in the modern world, something like that. So this is where I think this tradition can make a major contribution, because this is a very different approach to understanding the mind. So it does not have this quite same dichotomy. The Western thought has very much gotten into this pattern of thinking. So as I said, science, to me, it can be understood as a way of training the mind, and thinking a particular way that's very useful. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that way of thinking is the only way to think, or is necessarily going to give us the answer to every question. So in this Nalanda tradition, there is actually several different ways of understanding what is the relation between mind and matter, body and mind, that are quite different, but also quite developed within the tradition. And not only are there different paradigms of understanding, but there's tools for how to examine them. So this is what we have with debate and with these analysis of many different philosophical ideas, is can we examine? Because science also has to be grounded in philosophy. So sometimes it's not just a matter of gathering evidence. Sometimes people think of science as just a matter of going out and getting all the evidence and then putting it into a theory. But what's often more important is developing theories to explain the evidence we have. So we have a lot of evidence. We're getting more and more all the time about how the mind functions. Even in Western philosophy or Western science, there's not any agreed upon theory, which is also a sign that it's not something that is certain yet. So for example, the Buddhist teacher Alan Wallace, he gives out what I think is a good analogy. Something like photosynthesis is very well understood in science, and a good biologist can give you a very convincing explanation of how photosynthesis works. Whereas it's nothing like that in terms of understanding of the brain and the mind. Many different neuroscientists have completely different views of what exactly mind is. So I'll get into those a little bit in the afternoon. But briefly, for example, there's a question of, is mind exactly the same as the brain? So even if we say that the mind and the brain are intimately related and the mind can't function without a brain, is it the exact same thing as the brain? Or is it that the mind is a phenomenon that arises on account of the brain? So both of those views are held by different Western philosophers these days. The senses, yeah, exactly. How do the senses relate to the mind? So there's a lot of different questions about how these things work together. And there's not one cohesive view. What's that?
It's emergent property.
Yeah, emergent property. Yeah. So that would be this latter one, that it's not the exact same thing as the brain, but that it's something that only can emerge, from a brain, or maybe from a computer. That's also a question that some people have. So within our tradition here, we have a lot of tools for examining this. We have a lot of ways of talking about it. And so with the same evidence, it could be interpreted in a very different way. So even one modern philosopher that some of you might know, William James, I say modern, is 100 and something years ago, but generally speaking, the modern period, he looked at the evidence that was available to him at the time as a professor at Harvard, and as aware of all of the different studies that were going on, at least at the turn of the 20th century, of the mind and the brain. And he said, although the majority of his colleagues were quite convinced that the mind was something that was essentially a product of the brain. He could see that it could be interpreted three different ways. Given the same evidence that we all have, there could be three different possibilities. So the first one was a purely cause and effect, that the brain is one thing and the mind is its effect. And he gave an analogy. I can't remember in that context what he gave what analogy he used. The second one was that the mind is what allows for the functioning of the brain. He said in the way that pulling the trigger of a crossbow allows for the arrow to fly. And then the third one would be that the brain functions as a kind of filter, in the way that a prism, when light is exposed to a prism, it emerges as a rainbow, but the light is not coming from the prism. It's just that the prism filters the light and then it appears as a rainbow. He personally chose this third option. He felt that this actually explained better what the brain was and how it related to the mind, in which case the brain is not the mind. It's filtering something else that's coming from somewhere else. So even today, my feeling is that this is still relevant, that all three of those possibilities are still useful to consider. There hasn't been any new evidence in the past 150 years that has precluded any of those possibilities being correct. And this is something that really needs to be debated, that somebody, in order to debate it properly, somebody first has to know a lot of different things. You have to memorize a lot of different pieces of knowledge and then have the tools to debate it. But we could take any of those three positions, and this is what we do in debate in the monastery. We don't just take our own position. So even if I agree with James on his filter theory, I could take the cause and effect theory and try to defend it. And as I say, agree, even then, really the best approach is the doubt approach. That is to say, well, I'm intrigued by that theory, but I don't necessarily accept it until I can prove it. I won't say that it's my personal point of view. I would say that I don't know. I don't have a personal point of view. I just have doubt about it. And I have all three of those possibilities, and I'll try to defend any of them and see how well it works against all the different. Somebody could then present with different counter evidence or different ways of thinking that might negate it, and I might not be able to defend against it. So in terms of this engagement with modern science, yeah. No, actually, that's a good point. So like in some modern presentations of the mind, so one, I'll talk about this in the afternoon, Daniel Dennett, he talks about this lack of self, right? But it would appear that for him, self and mind are more or less synonymous, that there's an idea that we say mind, we say self, we're talking about some kind of projection of something based, I mean, in his opinion, there's not such a thing as a mind apart from a brain. And it seems to be kind of taken for granted that that's the same thing. Whereas in Buddhist philosophy, self and mind are not the same thing. They're related, but it's very important to understand the distinction between one and the other. What we call a self is something that's constructed based upon both mental and physical aspects, whereas the mental aspects themselves are not a self. Although there also were Buddhist philosophers such as Bhavaviveka, who did say that when we get down to it, the self is the mind. Chandrakirti, who our tradition takes as more authoritative, he very strongly rejected that. He said that view that Bhavaviveka has shows that he has not understood the Buddhist teachings on selflessness when he comes to think that the mind is actually the self. So there's a clear distinction, but we have to be very clear about what we're talking about. We just say the word self, say with the word mind, well, somebody could mean the same thing. So in Dennett's case, it doesn't necessarily mean he's confused. It just might mean that he's using two terms for the same concept in his philosophy. So maybe in our Buddhist philosophy, when we say self, we say mind. It's something different than what another philosopher might use. So that's a very important step in debate, is the two sides have to come to an agreement about what do we mean by this term. Otherwise, it's hard to have a discussion, although it's still possible. That's another point that Chandrakirti makes, is that even if we don't agree on the terms, we can still have a discussion in terms of using consequences. So you might believe that mind is something that I don't believe it is. I can still lead you to a consequence of your view without taking your position. Because I can say, for example, if you believe in a creator God and I don't, I can still argue with you, well, does God do this? Does God do that? If God does this, then it follows that he must also do this, even though I don't personally hold that view. It has to be based upon your view, not on my view. Okay, so yeah. Yeah, I will try to get more into it. Absolutely, yeah.
What about consciousness? So, where is the distinction between the mind and consciousness, or awareness and attention as well as
Yeah. Okay, so in Buddhist philosophy, actually, mind and consciousness are synonymous. That's also important, but attention is not. Attention is a mental factor. It's an essential mental factor. There are 5 mental factors that are called omnipresent, meaning that anything that is conscious has to possess all 5 of those. So that's attention. So first of all, contact, meaning there has to be an engagement with some object. Right? A mind does not exist without an object of mind. So contact with the object, and then attention towards the object. So actually, before that has to be discrimination. So for example, an eye consciousness, it makes some kind of discrimination. Although I'm not consciously thinking this is this, this is that, things appear to me as distinct things. Otherwise, it's just a big blur of color. So that is already built into the eye consciousness. So I mean, it seems from developmental studies that it gradually emerges during the first few years of life, that the baby starts to make the things appear slightly differently, and start to have more distinct boundaries between them. So that's the discrimination, and then attention. So then the mind has to stay with an object. If it doesn't stay with it doesn't actually go towards the object. There's no engagement with anything, and there's no real awareness of it. It has to stay at least for some moment. So before that has to be intention. So I'm mixing up the steps. So we start with contact, yeah, and then discrimination, and then intention. So intention has to be this wanting to focus on one thing rather than another. So if I have all these different things appearing, usually the eye consciousness is going to only focus on one. For example, with the eye consciousness, we don't notice this, but within the field of vision, there's only a very small piece that's actually clear, right? In the peripheral vision, it's very unclear. We don't notice that most of the time, but I couldn't read out of the corner of my eye. It might seem very clear because I can look at it, but when it's here, I can't see it as nearly as clearly as when it's right in the center. So there has to be some intention to focus on one thing rather than another. And then there has to be attention based on the intention, whereas the mind actually grasps at that and not just flickers between different things. And then finally, feeling. There's some affective quality to mind, which I want to talk about also later in terms of questioning whether artificial intelligence is mind. That's a question. That's really the big question for a lot of people conceptually, is does artificial intelligence have any affective quality? Although it can mimic human behavior, does it actually feel anything? And what is the feeling? But in Buddhist philosophy, feeling is inherent in mind, that there's no such thing as a mind that does not have a feeling. It doesn't have to be positive or negative. It can also be neutral, but there's some affective quality. But then, yeah, mind and consciousness are synonymous. So
the latest I heard was that these machines have become sentient.
Well, that's definitely a viewpoint, but whether it's again,
They're gonna leak this information.
I mean, for example,
Scientists
yeah.
have,
Well,
released it.
for example, when I was in school, I was taught that it's a theory. it was understood as a theory. I mean, there was a lot of debate about it. But again, if we're going to say that now it's become established, we have to say, well, where was there a very clear boundary where we now know, or was it just that they feel more and more confident about it? So is there some new discovery that's been made? So the argument that my teacher made in school was that if the machine can fool us into thinking that it's conscious, then we have to say it is. But I don't really take that as, I mean, at the time I wasn't sure, but now I don't think that's a good argument. I think it's an interesting argument, but I don't think it's proof.
Now, on the West Coast,
Right?
they have the proof.
What's the proof?
Well,
But can it be aware that it's a created entity that's created by us?
Mhm.
Could it be aware of that?
I don't know. I
That's
mean,
Mhm.
but I've heard the scientists.
Yeah,
discuss
I mean,
this.
yeah, I know, and I don't necessarily know what you're saying. It might be something
In
that
fact, they
has
said it's a
been
very
more recently.
dangerous development.
Yeah. Well, that's
They're
that's
very
another
worried.
question too. Yeah.
Very worried about it.
Yeah. But that has generally been, so I think that's usually ascribed to Alan Turing. There was a British-
Simulation theory.
Sorry? There's a British mathematician named Alan Turing, who at least, I don't know if he was the first one to come up with the idea, but generally it's ascribed to him, the idea that what they call the Turing test now, that if something can pass the Turing test, if the machine can fool us into thinking it's conscious, then it is. Because there's no reason to say that it's not. Just like you can fool me into thinking you're conscious. How can I say you're not conscious? If it's convincing enough to me that other people have consciousness from my interaction with them, then the same standard should be held for a machine.
Actually, Turing test is very limited in the sense.
Mm-hmm.
The Turing test only says that the interrogation with the machine and interrogation with the human being.
Mm-hmm.
One side is a machine and one side is human.
Mm-hmm.
You interrogate with both
Mm-hmm.
all kind of questions. And if you cannot distinguish, because you are not seeing them,
Mm-hmm.
it is through the type of the text.
Mm-hmm.
If you cannot distinguish that which side is a human and which side is a machine,
Mm-hmm.
that means the machine has passed the Turing
Yeah,
test.
yeah.
It is having intelligence.
Yeah. So yeah, to typing. Yeah.
So it is on the text base.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas intelligence has so many other factors.
Yeah. Well, that's the other question, is that's one argument against the Turing test, is that intelligence has more factors than simply being able to produce speech. Right. So I'd like to know, it would be interesting to see because if we're going to say that machines have intelligence, well, as I said before, there's many different views of what intelligence even is. So if we can prove that it has what I consider to be intelligence, well, somebody else might disagree with me, say, well, yeah, it has that, but I don't consider that to be intelligence. I consider that human beings have something more than that. The counter argument to that is that, well, then I must eventually you're led into taking solipsism, which is that you're forced into saying that because I don't have no way to prove that other people are intelligent, I have to just accept that I'm the only one who's intelligent. I don't know. Yeah. What's it?
Because it produces the text.
Yeah.
Over the chat.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the New York Times challenged in the court to OpenAI company that what learning of the language you have, it is based on the text published in the New York Times.
Mhm.
Whatever text it produces is having the approach of writing,
Mhm.
which is followed in New York Times.
Mhm.
So it is God. In fact, it is an imitation. And Turing test also is other name of the Turing test is imitation game.
Mhm.
It's called imitation game. So actually intelligence is far beyond that.
Mhm. Mhm.
But does intelligence have conscience?
Gotcha.
Like apply?
Okay, well, yeah, so again, we have to be very clear about our terms, right? So in Buddhist philosophy, as I said, mind and consciousness are synonymous, but again, that's just that the word that we translate into English as mind and the word that we translate into English as consciousness have synonymous meanings, at least in Tibetan understanding of Sanskrit philosophy. So many different people might have different views of this. And in modern times, certainly most philosophers of modern science of mind do make a distinction between mind and consciousness, but that doesn't mean that they're disagreeing with the Buddhists. It just might mean that they have a different meaning of those words. And then intelligence, so again, in Buddhist philosophy, at least the word that we usually translate as intelligence, which is lotro in Tibetan, I think is mati in Sanskrit, M-I-T-I. Yeah, mati. Yeah, mati. Yeah, mati. Yeah, that actually is not, in Buddhist philosophy, it's a bit vague. It's not something that's one of the mental factors, or is clearly stated as exactly what it means. But it is understood as obviously distinct from mind because, for example, we pray to Manjushri, please grant me intelligence. But that I already have a mind. I'm not praying, please give me a mind. Please increase my faculty of intelligence. So it's a faculty of mind. But in Buddhist philosophy anyway, I haven't seen anywhere where it's clearly stated what lotro or what mati is. Is it a mental factor? Is it a quality of mind? But then of course, in not modern times, then what is intelligence and how does that relate to mind? Can something have a mind without being intelligent? So oftentimes that's taken as synonymous, that when intelligence evolved, was there something that evolved in the same way they would say mind evolved. So when we say the first animals to have intelligence, we mean the first animals to have consciousness, to have mind. But really, we should be clear about what we mean. Maybe we can say, well, some animals, for example, fish, some people would say fish have consciousness, but don't have intelligence. Okay, but then what do you mean? Where's the line? What animal does have intelligence? Yeah.
What is beyond I consciousness? So what is Buddha talking about when he says that consciousness is empty or self is empty?
Mm-hmm.
So what is beyond that idea of I?
Mm-hmm.
What if I could see myself in other beings? Like I could see him as a different form of me, but has the same consciousness.
So you mean being able to just like have the concept that somebody else has a mind?
But consciousness.
If
What
I can circle back to one of the theories
Mhm.
that you mentioned about the prism,
Mm-hmm.
mind and the brain distinction,
Mm-hmm.
and then the third level being a prism, which is
Mm-hmm.
the mind,
Mhm.
and the light that is
Yeah.
light
Yeah.
that you filtered.
Mm-hmm.
So when come back to what you have been saying, so this is what I've been thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Won't that or rather, I'll ask you this question: how would you termify? How would you use etymology to define what you will call the white light coming into the prism?
Mm-hmm.
Should prism be called a brain and the rainbow the mind?
So you're saying in terms of that analogy, the white light, is that mind, is your question? Okay.
I'm not challenging the theory.
Mhm,
I'm supporting the theory and creating a
Mhm.
further question. If I challenge it, then it becomes another conversation.
Yeah, okay.
So I take the theory, for example, at this
Mhm.
instance as is, and I'm feeling that I resonate with the theory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what the theory is saying that there is a prism, which is the brain,
Mm-hmm.
and the mind, which is the product of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not essentially the entire product of the brain, but a filter through which the mind has been produced. The brain has been producing the mind.
Mm-hmm.
There is something before that,
Mm-hmm.
which is in the cause effect,
Yeah.
the true cause.
Yeah.
Cause.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. With that light,
The
yeah.
white light.
Yeah.
And then coming back to what he has been saying, that the consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
this is something that I'm trying to experience with my
Mhm.
capacity. It's probably that what the consciousness is, which is the collective consciousness,
Mhm.
and not the filtered consciousness
Yes,
that's
okay.
coming through the prism.
The mind is creating.
Yeah, so we're saying that the mind is the sort of the individual filtered consciousness. The consciousness is the more pure white light. Yeah. So that
Which is universal.
yeah, so that's a good statement. I mean, whether that's correct or not, I don't know, but that certainly is a little bit more precise about what we're talking about, right? Rather than just throwing terms around, we can start to say, well, my theory is that brain is like the prism and mind is like the rainbow and consciousness is like that clear light or white light. Then you have a little bit more distinction between the different terms. So then you can start debating about it, and you can start asking questions, and is it something that we can, and that we
There's
can,
one
yeah.
word that is coming to my mind.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that is something which resonates with Buddhism.
Yeah.
It's the word Brahman or Atman.
Mhm.
We use it in Sanskrit.
Mhm.
That is the or Param Atma.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Which, if I were to utilize
Mhm,
that
mhm.
as an attempt to give maybe
Mhm,
the
mhm,
consciousness,
mhm.
maybe the roots of
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah.
the English or
Mhm,
Western
mhm.
word, then might that be called the Param Atma or the
Yeah, that's a big question, and I did think about that when you said this before about the the sort of all consciousness, right? That's an idea that Buddhism tends to shy away from and often argue against. That they, wait, well, let me just say that the idea that there's some kind of all consciousness of which each of us is an individual manifestation. Buddhism tends to argue against that. It's not saying specifically that everything exists as an individual thing, but it doesn't like to just come up with this idea that it's all one also. That there's problems philosophically, at least in the Buddhist view, that come from saying that. If we say that there's this one consciousness, well, is that consciousness aware? Is it aware? If it's not aware, then how is it a consciousness?
I was, so yeah, sorry. So in Vedanta, it is
Yeah.
that consciousness
Mm-hmm.
is the unmanifested thing.
Right.
And it needs the manifested
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
to get itself manifested.
Exactly.
To
So
experience the manifested.
just, I mean, I hope you don't mind, but it's an example of debate. So, right, in Buddhist philosophy, then we debate. So we'd say, well, if it's unmanifested, is it consciousness or not?
That's Alan was saying.
So, yeah, so say if it's, so we'd say two consequences. One is, if unmanifested is not consciousness, then how is it unmanifested consciousness? It's not, it doesn't have, it cannot fulfill the term of unmanifested consciousness. It's just unmanifested nothing. Or if it is consciousness, then it's already manifested, because we say consciousness is that which is manifested.
The consciousness
Mm-hmm.
itself has, like you said, what's the meaning
Mm-hmm.
of that word? One is that if I open my eyes, or even if my eyes are closed because of the senses, and I can appreciate the
Mhm.
world, then I'm conscious,
Mhm.
right? If I get a lot of anesthesia, then I'm unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that is one aspect of consciousness.
I'm still there.
So, but so when you're anesthetized, is consciousness there?
So that's what I'm saying. There's the English word consciousness
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
has really two aspects, the
Mhm.
way Vedanta
Mhm.
looks at it.
Mm-hmm.
One is that if you are anesthetized,
Mm-hmm.
then you're not conscious.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one part of,
Mm-hmm.
That
but
one
where is
state. So if I can simplify it, so
in Vedanta?
what he's speaking about is
Yeah.
Upanishad.
Yeah.
He talks about different states of the mind. So
Yeah, yeah.
mind we were talking about, there may be bifurcations to that.
Mm-hmm.
So what he's talking about is pragyan dhanam.
Mhm,
That's
mhm.
deep dreamless slumber.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
exactly.
when you're in that state where
Mhm.
you're not aware, you know, the like
Mhm,
standby
mhm,
mode of
mhm,
laptop.
mhm.
Right. So then there is a dream state, or
Mhm.
which is called a subtle mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Your ideas of
Yeah,
your
yeah,
life,
yeah,
the
yeah.
I consciousness, that's what it is.
Mhm.
Then there is the gross state.
Mhm,
That's the
mhm.
physical, when we
Mhm.
are able to interact with the
Mhm.
world.
Mhm.
So there are like three states.
No, but then.
But you know, the dreamless state, that is the subtlest.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's the time when you can directly gain knowledge.
But
Pragyan Dhanam. But in that it said there's a fourth also.
There's a
which
fourth,
is not that state. Which is not a
Shuddhi.
state.
Which is Shuddhi.
Which is
fourth
Yeah.
called Turiya.
Turiya,
Yeah.
sorry.
Turiya.
Turiya.
So, but it's not a state.
Mhm.
So an example to understand it is that gold.
Mhm.
So let's say, you know, I have a gold bracelet, I have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
gold ring,
Mhm.
and I have a gold, let's say, pendant.
Mhm.
So I have three manifestations. So I say that this is gold,
Mhm.
right? Because it's practically gold. If this ring is
Mhm.
made of gold, I would say this is gold, right?
Mhm.
Pendant is also gold. So these are the three states. But the fourth is the material that it is made of, and
Mhm.
that is called consciousness.
Mhm.
That's Turiya. That's
Mhm.
named consciousness.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
it's not a state, but it's a manifestation.
Mhm. Okay, so yeah, we've had a lot of different ideas put out here. It's very good. It's very good to see that you're interested in these things. So yeah,
What Vedanta talks
yeah,
about, you know.
yeah.
Matter, then matter is
So-
consciousness, in other words.
Yes, matter really. Matter is
It's what Alan Watts talk about when he says that universe, we are the way of experiencing the universe. You know, we are universe experiencing itself. You know, consciousness is universe experiencing itself. So let's say there was these flowers, this universe, the beautiful sceneries, but there was no consciousness. There was no one to experience it. Would it have any meaning? So the manifestation and the unmanifested the same. The observer and the observed are the same.
That everybody knows.
And the other day I was reading Mandukya Upanishad, so the commentaries. So I was reading the preface. So they were talking about that there are a lot of places, the Upanishads, they are talking about the Buddhist terms. They use nirvana, they've used a lot of Buddhist terms, even emptiness in some places. So there was talk, a professor was saying that these are wrong. But actually, they were in the Nalanda tradition, like they were having debates. So they were also having debates with the Buddhists. And I think the Buddhist non-self or no self, as we talk about in Pragya Paramita, is equal to all self, which the Upanishads are talking about.
Yes, the shunya.
The shunya, yeah. We also talk about it. The Upanishads also talk about the shunya. So I think they're the same, in my opinion. But
Well, that's a very big question. So when we have these kind of discussions, this is what part of the tradition is, to refine the way of discussing it, right? So this is why in debate, it's often very direct, right? So we have to be able to make a very clear statement. This is this because this is that. And then the person can say yes or no, right? So I think it's, as I say, it's very useful to hear that everyone obviously has thought about this quite a bit. And so one step to take is to develop a way of discussing it. Again, that it can be falsifiable. This is, again, what I said about science, that it doesn't have to be falsifiable by external means, but it can be something that I can make a statement such that, well, if somebody could say something that could prove this wrong. And so, for example, the statement mind and consciousness are the same, it's not exactly falsifiable unless I make further statements. If I say mind and consciousness are the same, and then I say that the mind is like the rainbow and the consciousness is like the white light, then I lead to a contradiction, right? So we have to be very step by step, very clear, and then we can start to refine the way of speaking about it. Because here it's understood that the way of speaking about it is not just superfluous to understanding it. It's not just like there's the thing itself, and then the way of speaking about it is kind of it's just a minor point. The way of speaking about it completely changes how we experience it. As I said before with the analogy of science, that if we start talking about everything that exists as having some kind of material basis, then that's how it will appear to us at a certain point. And it will be very hard to think outside of that way of discussing it. So yeah, I think it's a little past 1 o'clock now, and I know other people had some things to say, but we can certainly have more. And I apologize for those of you on Zoom. I've kind of haven't been responding to the questions on here because I'm focusing on the audience here. But certainly, if you have questions, please write them down in the afternoon. We can also address those questions. So let's have a break now. It's 1:07, it looks like. So maybe till, say, at 2:30. Is that okay? Yeah, 2:30. People can go and have lunch, and then we can come back. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
Thank you for coming. Yeah,
all the best.
thank you. Yeah, see you again. Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
What made it sentient? Like, what made the scientists say that?
Yeah, they were very worried. Last year I had a meeting with them in Europe. So this was the latest news that came from California.
So is that because they have the intellect?
No,
but they
they've
don't
developed
have the
they've developed the feeling aspect.
they create AGI, artificial general intelligence. What we were talking about, we have access to ASI, that's artificial specific intelligence. We give it a specific problem, it solves it. AGI is different, it functions like us.
So they were a bit worried.
which stands for generative.
General.
General.
It's like general,
Yes,
generally
general.
intelligent like us.
Yes, so it's, as somebody said earlier, that it only gives you back what it gets. I would like to add to that, with a little addition, because I have a lot of background on that. That actually generative, it generates its own intelligence from a lot of the data. So it's not just based on that which we have previously. Now it does more. So that's why we have to be careful. So there's the other aspect, that it can go beyond what we tell it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Enjoy lunch now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.